You've done this more times than you could probably count. Taken something that actually happened and quietly chosen which version of it to tell. But somewhere around the 10th time, or the 100th, something stops being a choice at all. The edited version stops sounding like an edit. It starts sounding like memory. In the late 1970s, a psychologist ran a small, unremarkable-looking experiment that had nothing to do with computers, screens, or feeds, decades before any of those existed, and predicted, with unsettling precision, what would happen once an entire species began performing itself in public, continuously, for an audience that never entirely logs off. What that experiment actually found gets left out of almost every conversation about social media and identity. It's the part that matters most. Most people operate on a quiet assumption that there's a clean line between the self performed online and the self underneath it. A costume, put on before opening the app, hung back up the moment the phone gets set down. Whatever gets posted, curated, filtered, captioned into something better than the actual Tuesday it came from, sits safely on the surface, while the real you waits untouched backstage, available whenever the performance ends. Picture the version of this that plays out 100 times a day, in rooms all over the world. Someone at dinner, phone raised, adjusting the angle of a plate of food until it looks like the meal they wish they were having, rather than simply eating the one in front of them. Nothing about the moment is dishonest, exactly. It's just aimed somewhere other than at the experience actually taking place. The trouble with the backstage assumption is that it depends on the performance eventually stopping, on there being a curtain, a door, a moment when the mask comes off and the ordinary face takes back over. For most of human history, that was mostly true. Public life had edges. It ended when you walked home. The sociologist Erving Goffman spent his career studying exactly this structure, decades before any of it went digital. He described everyday life as a kind of theater, split into a front stage, where a performance is given for whoever happens to be watching, and a backstage, where the performance drops and something closer to the unmanaged self gets to exist. Goffman's real insight wasn't that people perform. He assumed everyone does, constantly, and treated it as a basic feature of social life rather than a flaw in it. His real insight was that a person needs somewhere the performance isn't required, or the front stage stops feeling like a role and starts feeling like the only self left running. Which is the part most conversations about the online self skip entirely. It isn't that people perform. Performance is old as having other people around to notice you at all. What's new is how much of daily life now happens with no clearly marked backstage left. The audience doesn't fully leave when the phone gets put down. The record doesn't fully close. There's rarely a door. 24 centuries earlier, Plato described something with an eerie structural resemblance to this, in an entirely different register. In his allegory of the cave, prisoners are chained facing a wall, watching shadows cast by objects passing behind them that they can never turn to see directly. The prisoners don't simply misunderstand the shadows. Because the shadows are the only version of reality ever made available to them, the prisoners come to treat the shadows as the whole of what's real. Plato's real interest was never the shadows themselves. It was what happens to someone who spends long enough mistaking the shadow for its source, whether, given the chance to finally turn around, they would even recognize what had been casting it the entire time. Which brings the story back to that experiment from the late 1970s. Researchers studying communication, including the psychologist Tori Higgins, asked people to describe another person to an audience they believed either liked or disliked that individual, tailoring the description warmer or harsher depending on who was supposedly listening. Later, with no warning the experiment wasn't over, they asked participants what they actually thought of the person being described. Memory had shifted. People weren't just reciting the tailored version anymore. Somewhere between telling it and being asked to recall it, the tailored version had started to feel like what they had believed all along. The finding earned a name that undersells exactly how unsettling it is. Saying is believing. Not lying, exactly. Something closer to a quiet renovation of memory, carried out by the mind itself, to keep what you said and what you actually think from sitting in open contradiction with each other for very long. The psychologist Leon Festinger had already described the mechanism that makes this renovation necessary. When behavior and belief pull in different directions, when what you posted doesn't quite match what you actually feel, the resulting tension, cognitive dissonance, doesn't sit quietly waiting to be resolved by conscious effort. It gets resolved, usually beneath awareness, by whichever side is cheaper to change. And revising a memory is almost always cheaper than deleting a post that's already been seen, already been liked, already been folded into how other people now think of you. Which means every tailored caption, every angle chosen because it plays better than the truth of the moment, isn't just shaping what other people believe about you. It's casting a small, repeated vote for which version of events gets to survive inside your own memory. Cast that vote enough times, in the same direction, and it stops being a record of what happened. It becomes indistinguishable from what happened. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, writing decades before any of this existed, described something in early childhood that offers the clearest name yet for what's actually at stake. Winnicott noticed that children sometimes develop what he called a false self, a compliant, agreeable presentation built specifically to meet a caregiver's expectations, protecting a more vulnerable true self underneath by keeping it out of view. In healthy development, the false self stays flexible, a useful social tool, deployed and set back down, never mistaken for the whole person. Winnicott was writing about infants and their mothers, not about smartphones. The extension being made here is not his, but the mechanism he named doesn't actually require an infant to operate. It only requires an audience whose approval starts to feel necessary for safety. Perform compliance long enough, convincingly enough, for an audience that never stops watching, and the false self doesn't just protect the true one anymore. It starts doing all the talking. The true self doesn't disappear, exactly. It simply stops being called on, and the less something gets called on, the less fluent it stays. Carl Jung had a related term for whatever gets excluded from the version of yourself put forward for approval, the shadow. Not the malicious opposite of who you are, but everything true about you that didn't make the cut. The boredom, the envy, the ordinary Tuesday, the thought too unphotogenic to post. The shadow doesn't vanish just because it's been left off the feed. It goes underground, and it tends to resurface sideways, as comparison, as anxiety scrolling through other people's front stages at midnight, as a hollow feeling with no obvious cause, arriving right after posting something that got exactly the response it was engineered to get. None of this actually needs a phone to operate. It only needed one to become constant. The same mechanism runs underneath the version of yourself that shows up for a job you've outgrown, agreeable and enthusiastic on schedule. It runs underneath the friendship maintained mostly out of habit, cheerful by default, never quite honest about how it's changed. A joke that isn't funny gets laughed at anyway. A disagreement that actually matters gets swallowed instead. A feeling that's completely real gets edited down to something postable, something that plays. Each of those, on its own, looks like nothing, a small, forgivable social convenience. The danger was never any single edit. It's what a few thousand small edits, repeated for years, quietly do to which version of you starts to feel like home. So here's the uncomfortable part, and there's no way to make it land gently. If you tried right now to describe yourself with no thought of who might see the description, would the sentence still sound like you? Or would it take a moment to find, underneath the version you've gotten used to performing? Ask yourself, honestly, when you last said or posted something because it was simply true, rather than because it would be well received. Not out of dishonesty. Out of habit, so old it no longer registers as a decision at all. None of this makes you fake. Almost everyone alive right now is running some version of the same adaptation, because almost everyone is answering to an audience that never fully logs off, in a species that evolved to care, very deeply, about what the tribe thinks of it. The instinct to perform isn't a flaw. It's ancient, and it kept people alive for most of human history. It simply never had to survive a version of the tribe that watches constantly and never goes home. Which leaves the harder question underneath the one this started with. Everyone performs, and always has. That part was never really in question. What's less certain is this. After years with the curtain never falling, is there still a face underneath the mask that you would actually recognize as your own?